Right. I think I have leave to go now, have I? Yes. Excellent. Right. Well, I'd like to welcome you all to the last day of our conference, and we're privileged to have this morning Professor Dr. Victor Borden. Now, Victor has got quite deep roots in the EAIR. He has attended many conferences. He has contributed to our publications, and he has also co-edited one of our books. Isn't that right, Victor? So he has done many important tasks for the EAIR. Then I asked him for a CV. Now, you wouldn't believe it, or maybe you would. That CV was 49 pages long. So I thought that was a bit much for a Wednesday morning, and I'm just going to concentrate upon some of his more recent distinctions. So he was awarded the Outstanding Service Award and the Sidney Zuslow Scholar Award, and more recently he has been given the John Stecklein Distinguished Member Award in 2023, and then also the Distinguished Member from EAIR. And I don't know if you're aware, but sometimes these Distinguished Member Awards give a lot of pleasure to people. In fact, I know somebody who got one. So without any more delay, I will simply hand over to our distinguished member, dear Victor Borden. Victor, we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, dear colleagues. I am delighted and honored to be here. I have a lot of material to cover, so I'm going to get to it quickly. But before doing so, I do want to acknowledge Rosalind Pritchard, who I've had the honor to become a close colleague and dear friend now for the last few years. And I was trying to think of what metaphor to use for her role in this organization. I was thinking of her personally more as a gem, but I believe a guiding light would be my preferred metaphor. And I thank you, Rosalind, for all your work you've done for this community and for us even in the US as we learn vicariously from you. Thank you. Okay, as I said, I have 57 slides to go through in less than 30 minutes, so hold on to your seats, as they say. You see the title of my talk. I debated that a long time and just said, I'll leave it at that, because it's in the program that way. Even if I don't talk about it, it's important to have what's in the program, but I will talk about that. I'll set the context and purpose for this and then spend most of the time talking about my own experience. This is a very personal story because I've been living in this, working in this space for a long time, as you will see. I have some statistics on that. That's the other thing to note. I'm a very statistical, quantitatively oriented person, even though I have more recently been enlightened by more qualitative methods and by my colleagues and my students, thankfully. So first, let me set the context for this, and I don't want to go into it deeply, and I'm not intending to be a definitive analysis of the context, but just to remind you of some of the things around us within which this is situated. First is the growth of accountability pressures that when you read the literature, everyone cites back to the 1980s in the US as one of the earlier ramping ups that happened. Many reasons behind this. We could spend, I could do a seminar on this, a graduate seminar, but just leave that. The second thing is all that's going on in the world around us as we move from higher education being seen as a public good to mostly as a private good, from the old left to the new right. I don't know that we use the term the old left, but since it's the new right, there must have been an old left. And certainly in our country, from debate, good debate, to just divisiveness, argument without people yielding any thought. And I hope, one of the reasons I love coming to Europe is I think debate is still alive here. I do know that's not always the case. And this movement of all higher education systems from being very much a state-controlled and state-oriented venture to a global venture at this point. And many, many countries moving away from state control to autonomy for institutions. And with autonomy comes accountability because it's other people's money we are spending. And then, of course, advances in information technologies. When I started, I was using punch cards on an IBM mainframe to do my SPSS analyses, but SPSS did exist then. And now, of course, I'm asking ChatGPT what it thinks, and then using that and doing analysis in incredibly sophisticated software that I can do on a handheld device. So the world has changed in this period of time I'm referring to, from the early 1980s to now, because it so happens that that's the period in which I have worked in this field. I also want to remind us about different approaches in the United States versus Europe, and of course, characterizing two very variable places with a few where it does not do it justice. But we are a much more technical and nuts and bolts driven focus in institutional research in the US, and it's become even more so that in recent years. We have a larger community by virtue of the larger higher education landscape within which we work and the more diverse one. But everything has shifted much more towards helping IR practitioners do their day jobs and less to the academic side of things. We've lost that a little bit. And of course, that's why I love coming here. There's much more of a big picture view of things, much more debate and questioning of the underlying values. And it is much more public good driven than we are in the United States. In terms of this dichotomy or tension I'm going to talk about between accountability and improvement, accountability and innovation, there are different requirements for them. On the accountability side, it is served best by centralization, standardization, conformity, and compliance. But on the improvement or innovation side, it's much more about decentralization and liberalization and so on, staying inside the box versus thinking outside the box. Even the words couldn't stay in the box. My own approach. This is something I've learned from my students who do qualitative research. You're supposed to have a positionality section in your dissertation where you are coming from, because that view, it's very much acknowledged in qualitative research that you must state that when you're doing your paper. We don't state that in quantitative research. We should, because it's a fallacy that quantitative research is not influenced by your positionality. So myself, I identify as a post-positivist, and for me, post means that there is no reality. There are metaphors that we try to construct and build better metaphors for our work, and we subject them to empirical validation. But there's no real truth behind it. Truth is much more of a self-perception, and I'm a social psychologist by training, so I think more about how you perceive things than how they really are. The work I do is very much in the area of scholarship of practice, what might be called clinical research in medicine. I do research on the practice of institutional research, on accountability and improvement and so on. But I like to have under that, and this is where my guilty conscience comes in, a critical inquiry to question the values that underlie it. I'm delighted that there's now an area called critical quantitative methods, and I appreciate that very much, although honestly in the US it's entirely based on identity issues and not on other issues that it should be based on. I also use theory in my work a lot, but I don't, well, I have built theory when I was a graduate student. That was part of what I was doing, but I use theory now as a lens. I also critique theory based on how it matches reality, and as one of my idols, former New York Yankees catcher Yogi Berra once said, in theory there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there certainly is. So I use theory as lenses. And I try to take, if not an inter and multidisciplinary place, a new word I learned at the Leiden conference was a transdisciplinary approach. So I hope you will see that in the work coming up. Personally, I've been working now in this area for 42 years, so since the early 1980s. I primarily work in these three domains. One is doing institutional research for a particular institution, about 4 or 5 of them over my history. Being a professor, first in psychology, because that's what my degree is in. And then when I moved to another campus, I went to the higher education program because that's where my work is. And then I engage myself in our communities, in AIR and EAIR, and work with colleagues internationally. For me, that has been the most deeply influential experience in terms of understanding things. And I say that understanding things, we all know the more you know you don't know. Or as Bob Dylan put it, I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now. So now I will tell you what little I've come to know about this area through that experience. So these are statistics on my run in academia, if you will, 61st year in school. I've never been out of school from fall of 1963 to the present. 49th year in college. My parents thought I would eventually get a real job, but it never happened. 40th year full-time employed, and 32nd year at Indiana University. But more importantly, 43 years since I first started working in institutional research, 34 times at AIR. This is my 17th EAIR. By far the two conferences I have gone to the most and have thoroughly enjoyed that experience. And you wonder, what toll has this taken on me? Yes, that is how I looked. In January of 1981, somewhat ironic, I think I should do a Hair Club for Men commercial at some point. I think I look somewhat like Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead, and in fact, I am wearing a Jerry Garcia tie, which is interesting because Jerry Garcia never wore a tie in his life, and yet there is a tie series created by his estate. But also what happened in that period of time is I met in working at a research project on urban parks in environmental psychology. I worked with a more advanced graduate student who, when he completed the dissertation, became the director of student affairs research at the institution and brought me along as a graduate assistant, and that is when I started. I also met another graduate assistant in the office who would then become my wife. I cleaned up pretty quickly. By June of 1982, when we married, and at our 40th anniversary, we were still going strong. And we got to produce this lovely family, pride of my lives. My son, who is emulating my hairstyle these days. And the newest member, no, not the dog, my daughter's husband, our tuba-playing son-in-law, Bruno Gutierrez. So I come to this I was a graduate student in social psychology at the University of Massachusetts, steeped in what I call psychologized game theory, which was game theory where the outcomes are not money, but are perceptions. I extended the work of Kelly and Thibault in my master's thesis on how through interpersonal relationships we change, first to accommodate our partners, and then as we experience those things, we actually change our own dispositions so we don't have to any longer accommodate our partners. And then switch to a Lewinian force field analysis of the student-college bond for my dissertation. Also in social psychology, I was well steeped in attribution theory and self-efficacy, self-determination theory, which Manya talked about on Monday, and organizational learning. Since that time, I've added a few key other lenses that I think are important to this work, like principal agent theory, GLONACAL, that's global, national, local lens of Simonson and Rhodes, information and asymmetry, George Akerlof's work, Herbert Simon's attention economy, and as I said, this notion of transdisciplinarity that those of you who are at Leiden heard a keynote on, which had a deep effect on me, actually, as you will see in some ways. So on the airplane over, I reread a few classics, and I had to cite Heroin, because he cited me. Back at you, Heroin. But no, seriously, and the conclusion I draw from that is not at all what Huisman and Curry were saying, but it's what I took from it. Just as I know, what I'm saying is not so important, it's what you take from it. And what their article was talking about, the different types of accountability, professional, political, and so on. And they were saying, we're primarily talking about professional and political here, but their interviews were a lot with faculty members at universities who were talking about accountability being the intra-organizational accountability, the annual reports they had to fill out that then were used for promotion and tenure and for faculty annual salary determination. And so it's interesting, that's what we who are sort of at the institutional level dealing with external accountability are inflicting upon our colleagues. So we take what we are experiencing outside and we drive it through the organization to collect the necessary data needed for the external audiences. And so that's where I came up with where you stand depends on where you sit. And this is very important because I'm going to talk about, in effect, the fact that we maybe should rethink how much we are replicating external calls for accountability inside. That may be one of our problems. And then Dylan Sue, whose article on transparency and quality brought in very well those ideas of how information asymmetry, which the famous article on that is The Market for Lemons by George Akeroff. And that is about how, you know, there's unequal information on both sides of those who provide the service and those who participate in that. And because of that, it drives down quality because our participants, clients, stakeholders, whatever you wish to call them, we'll refer to them as stakeholders shortly. They don't know what this is about, and we are the experts on it, and so we use that asymmetry to our advantage. And we basically, the worst of this are predatory practices, where we bring people into this and take advantage of them and do not deliver to them that which would be most useful to them. I also revisited Finlow's article on accountability and innovation, of which I quote out of the aspect about that dynamic tension in relation to these issues. And then the last one I read, which was particularly interesting to me, was the 7 silos of accountability, which talks about learning outcomes and accreditation and institutional research and decision and so on as silos. Because if there's one, that is not my experience, because I've been working against that all my life. Thank you, Trudy Banta, because she is the woman who really mentored me in that view, and I'll develop that further as well. So from my extensive CV, and it is that long because I get, you know, it's part of annual review. You have to add every single thing you do to your CV. I do write a lot. I would not, some of these are high quality articles, but a lot of these are more impact or articles that are trying to provide to practitioners information that's derived from the literature that will help them in their practice. But I did this analysis while I was coming over, and I took out what I thought were the articles most about accountability and improvement, and it was the lion's share. It does not include my most highly cited article, which is about gender differences in administrative workload between male and female faculty, which I did with I'm the co-author to Cassie Guarino, a higher education economist. And yes, women are taking care of the academic family, as it turns out. Read the article if you want to understand better why. But anyway, I did this analysis and laid out my publications and kind of marked where the time differences was, and I found it interesting that I've been doing a fairly balanced writing between accountability improvement and the two of them, but it had a period there, right in the middle of the 2010s, where I really focused mostly on improvement and less on accountability, because that was what I was doing for my institution, so I had better write about it. I also, behind every publication, there are several presentations, and I could not do the analysis on the 142 I identified, but I did do a word cloud on their titles, for what it's worth, which I don't think is very much actually, but it's somewhat interesting. And of course, these slides are available to you, so you can look at them more slowly later. So I decided I would try to take all that thinking and experience of 42 years and boil it down into my rock album, The Best Of. Those of you in the know, I chose Roger Dean as my cover artist. This is the Tales of Topographic Oceans cover from the Yes. But this is the one that turned me away from Yes. It's Yes album, Fragile, and Close to the Edge. Those are the Yes albums. Rick Wakeman's Yes, yes. Anyway, so let me go through, use this musical metaphor, which is very apt because one of the other things I have done is been part of an institutional research parody band called the EAIR Windbreakers. And here are some of our more relevant lyrics to the accountability improvement dilemma. The upper right and bottom left were written by me. The upper left is State Report Writer is to Paperback Writer, the Beatles song, so in your head you can sing it to that. The bottom right is the performance indicator song about how we will surely develop effective measures that please everyone to the tune of just my imagination. And then in the middle, our drummer, Ty Cruz, wrote a great takeoff of God Bless the USA about the interesting voluntary system of accountability, the VSA, that one of our associations came up with as a sort of answer to the pressures for accountability. Well, God bless the VSA. In the most southern US way of using that term, and that's very interesting what they mean by God bless this in the South. It's not necessarily positive. So early in my academic career, I joined the faculty at Indiana University, the Indianapolis or IU-PUI campus, which will now be IUI as of next year. IU and Purdue divorced, and now there will be a new campus or a new name. But in my early years, I worked with Trudy Bonta on a volumes of new directions for institutional research on performance indicators, accountability, and improvement. And it was a very hopeful volume about how, yeah, if we take seriously how we measure and show others the effect of what we're doing, we can use these for both purposes. That was a pretty naive view. So about 16 years later, or 14 years later, I was writing more reactive pieces. This was to a special issue of New Directions for Institutional Research, which was a reaction to what the Spellings Commission, which was a governmental commission in the second George W. No, there was only one. George W. Bush served 2 terms. So this was in his second administration. His Secretary of Education had a big panel and came up with these pronouncements of how bad a job higher education is doing on informing consumers about what students get out of it, basically the information asymmetry. And so we wrote a volume about this, and the chapter that expresses best my own work is that which questions the validity of accountability measures from a validity perspective, and John Young, my co-author, is a validity scientist at Educational Testing Services. You can look into that later, but you'll see that show up in my remarks. And then a few years later, I did a series of articles that came out of the work. I did a Fulbright specialist at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Kwan's alma mater, in South Africa. And this is where I expressed my view of what I see as the sort of underpinning problem or issue. But several other people have characterized it in different ways. So we're using different metaphors, and that's what I'll take you through now. Underneath the accountability improvement debate is this issue of quality, as it's quality assurance. So therefore, we first have to understand what quality is. And so this is part of my oeuvre of work about that issue from a presentation. And what I've done, I literally pulled slides out of presentations I did, so you'll see the framing change based on where I did the presentation. So this was at a symposium that was done with Education Testing Services and the Association for Institutional Research. So the first thing is to show what do we mean by quality. And so I have here some quotes from some famous policymakers, Jamil Salmi at the World Bank, Jamie Merisotis, who's the CEO of one of the large foundations in the US that focuses exclusively on higher education, the Lumina Foundation. And as you can see, Jamil takes a very traditional view, a prestige view, top institutions, best students, best faculty with sizable budgets and autonomy, you know, that's classic view of higher education. Their status is conferred by outside world on the basis of international reputation, whatever that is and however that comes about. Jamie Merisotis pushed back and said, no, it's about what students gain. It's about learning. It's about how we impact students. Doug Bennett took that further and said it's about value added. Students come to us and then we enrich them and they come out, and how much value did we add to their learning, their lives, what have you. And John Lombardi pushed back on that and said, well, that's not good. What if they were at the 8th grade level and we got them to like the mid-college level? That's a lot of growth, but if we graduated them and they weren't yet at that high level, that's not necessarily a good thing. And what about those institutions that take the best and brightest? They don't add as much value as those institutions that deal with other populations that require more learning or more support. So, and then finally, Ferdinand van Pruninsky from, this is from Dublin City University, president at the time, said, no, it's about content. So our policymakers and thought leaders don't agree on what quality is. And certainly our stakeholders, they don't disagree, they have different needs for quality from our institution. Students, and I was fascinated when during Manya's talk, Bruno asked a question afterward and referred to students as clients or customers. And Manya pushed back as, no, they're participants. I'm describing them as stakeholders here, along with parents, along with us, and academic staff and trustees. And we all want different things out of it, and what we think is quality is different depending on who we are. And we are multiple people. We have been students, we are parents, we are staff, and our interests in higher education are based on where we are coming from on that. Oops. So I used to start my presentations with conclusions. I thought it was cute. And I remember someone once said, tell them what you're going to say, tell them it, and then tell them what you said. So I started with my conclusions. Quality is mission and stakeholder specific. It looks different at Harvard than it looks at Miami-Dade Community College. There is a big difference, this is my lived experience, between what you do to provide information and analysis and evidence for improvement and what you do to provide it for accountability. There are points of leverage, they are related, and we'll develop that much further. And this was still that naive view. If we can only do this better in the institution, then all will be well. But at least I had my little perchance to dream down there. So I knew it wouldn't be easy. So then came this period in about 2010, 29. I did a Fulbright at University of KwaZulu-Natal, or UKZN. And at the same time, I also had an EAIR presentation. This one, I got to put one of my favorite minimalist slides of all time. But I also did a related presentation at the Warsaw EAIR back in 2011. So if you were there and heard this, you'll just have to hear it again very quickly. So first is characterizing this as a dilemma. Well, we do have responsibilities to be accountable. There are legitimate external interests. That's influenced a lot by the work of Donald Schoen in The Reflective Practitioner. And then what we do for improvement does not satisfy external environments because it's way too detailed and other characteristics I'll describe in a moment. But what we do for accountability is much less palatable to us. And I boiled this down to, we wouldn't do what we should do if they weren't forcing us to do so, but what they are forcing us to do is not what we should be doing. And I recognize this as a paradox. But before I get to the paradox, let me give you two other views of this. Nancy Shulock at Cal State Sacramento, or Sac State as the locals call it, talked about the culture gap of accountability. What is it that policymakers want? Unambiguous, concise, quick, no uncertain terms, no excuses, no caveats. Just give us the facts. Tell us what happens. The academic community, first of all, it takes more words to express it because it's a deeper thought. They find that bottom line approach threatening, inappropriate, and potentially damaging. They don't want to be reduced to a few numbers of what is a very rich, varied experiences across our institutions, which I came to appreciate that diversity much more in a project I got to run for 7 years, the Carnegie Classification of Institutions of Higher Education. Still too long a title, still called that. But it really gave me an appreciation for the diversity of higher education in the US. Not so much from categorizing them, but from the calls I would get from people at every different type of institution, which was by far the most wonderful part of having that responsibility for a while. And learning what life is like at a small regional, private and religious private and so large public. Life is so different in those places, and yet we're in the same business. It's hard to imagine. So there's that culture gap. Peter Ewell, another one of my mentors and a frequent attender of EAIR in the 80s and 90s, so he goes back a ways, he talked about conflicting paradigms. The accountability paradigm is much more focused on summative, external, compliance-oriented judgment. Internal improvement is much more formative, engaged, multi-method triangulation, and you communicate differently. So fundamentally different activities or approaches, and yet these are supposed to be one thing in many ways, in many people's thinking. I picked up a book in doing this research on paradoxical tensions, which really influenced me. I've looked since. It's not very highly cited, so maybe it's not great work in the field of whatever field it's in. I'm not quite sure. It's a biologist, and he talks about how these paradoxes exist across all aspects of life, even down to the cellular level. And he does this by distinguishing between these dualisms. And one that spoke to me was the self-other dualism, which in social psychology we know as the actor-observer bias in attribution perceptions. When you say, why did that happen? Well, the tendency for us as actors, we are looking out. And we see cause related to all that is outside of us. It's the students, it's the facilities, it's the money. It's not me. I would be able to work perfectly if I had the right materials from the outside world. Well, our accreditor friends and our policymakers and overseers, they're looking at us. And when a person looks at another, they tend to over-attribute causality to the person. And that's where I tripped, but you fell. No, it's sorry, I have that fact. Yeah, I tripped and you fell. You know, there was a rock, there was a crack in the sidewalk. That's why I tripped. And if I'm watching someone else, oh, that person is pretty clumsy, they just fell. That's what's going on also in accountability. Our view is, well, it's not about us, it's about the resources we have to use. Whereas our colleagues outside are looking right at us. And it's you, it's your programs. That's the problem, because that's what I see students are going through. Well, that's just one of like 7 dualisms that Wagner goes through. The second one I will just mention is this meaning matter, which really is the positivist constructivist kind of difference. The facts are facts, no matter where they come from. They mean the same thing versus, oh no, facts only have meaning in context, and you cannot generalize across different contexts. And of course, we're somewhere trying to find some balance between these dualisms. So Andreas Wagner says to live with these, or this is the situation of living with these, that neither party of a dispute sees its entrenched position is just one side of the coin. We raise ourselves, we push on our views, but we're not realizing that really these are the same thing on different sides. And the conclusion being, nothing may be wrong except the belief that one of them is the truth. So, how do we find a constructive path within these conditions? I offered these principles of effective accountability in those days. The first 2 are certainly not something I came up with, if you will. Every time you read anything on accountability, you see the question of quality. Quality of what? Quality for whom? And that's what I was referring to. Different stakeholders have different interests and so on. Well, I focused more on the things that don't read as easily, connecting performance with outcomes. It's one thing to get these measures of what happened, but unless you can connect them to what the universities do, what the students went through at the university, then you cannot make decisions about the processes based on the outcomes unless you can connect them, and similarly with the inputs. And then the validity issue. People were putting forth measures that the validity, if no one is looking at or questioning. And what happened to the Bureau of Standards? Certainly the people in accountability are not paying attention to it because they're just deciding these are measures that seem to us to be the right ones to look at. And of course, they do engage with us and they say, well, if you're going to look at a few measures, that's probably the best you can do. So when I turn my spotlight on improvement, I bookend that with two works I was involved in, one with a colleague, Michelle Hansen, who's now the chief IR officer at Ohio State, and the other one much more recent, which is in one of the books, one of the EAIR books, and was presented at the Leiden Forum on evidence-based framework for transforming higher education. And that is a triangulation framework. And you know, anytime you read something and discover it for the first time, you think, wow, I've never known about this before. And what I noticed about this was a lot of people who talk about triangulation focus on the bottom, methods and data sources. And we raised to the top the triangulation of interpreters. It's not just about what you're finding and how you're studying it in the multiple ways, but different people have different views of what it brings, what we get from that. And what's important is bringing those views together systematically to make effective decisions. You need to involve the researcher, the practitioner, and the voices of those who are represented in the work, the students, diverse peoples, staff. There's a necessity. This information doesn't have the same meaning to everyone, and if you want to use it effectively, you need to bring those people together with the information. So out of that, we created this idea of strategic academic research and development, a volume now in preparation for a volume of, well, they haven't agreed yet, I hope they will, on From New Directions of Higher Education. This is not suggesting that this is how we should do institutional research. It is impossible to do strategic research like this on everything. This is to say that if you want to really make a change, if there are important things to change, this is the way that it can be approached, or tailoring this approach to settings and people. And the first is deciding what to do the research on. What are those critical issues that you really need to apply this kind of power to? And for us, we've chosen things like performance gap in STEM classes for students in their beginning of college, because we know there's a lot of inequity in that. Students of color fail math and science courses at a much higher rate than do students of the dominant culture. And that's very important these days because, I didn't get too much into this, but college has become much more necessary, a college education, for getting even a livable wage. It's what high school was in the 1950s and 60s is what a college degree now, it's not just for the elite, for the few, it's now necessary, or some post-secondary training is necessary for virtually any career at this point. So once you've identified what you want to work on, you have to bring together the appropriate parties, and then you have to do some research and a dialogue and debate to decide, well, what could we do about this? What could we do different based on best practices or effective practices? And then you choose an idea and you try it, you pilot it, and you see how it looks, and you might find, oh, it looks great. So you say, let's ramp it up and see if it continues to work, and you use formative kinds of assessment at that point, and then the cycles go on and on. So a great little example from this work, we were working with people who do the introductory chemistry sequence that many students need to take for any science major. And so one of my colleagues, who I'm still working with on this, she tried something new in one of her courses. She said, okay, we've been teaching this course the same old way, very much content-based. Let me move to a different approach that involves mastery of learning and some flipped classroom and things like that. And Matt, my word, it had spectacular results. We did a propensity score study to see how her students did compared to equivalent students who took it the regular way. And it was not even close. She had like a 95% pass rate, and the others have a 70% or a 60% pass rate. So it's quite different. And so then you say, okay, let's put this in now. Wait a second. What happens when they take the next class? They failed miserably. Fortunately, enough of them got to it, so when you looked at the combination of the two, they did better than those who took the class the other way. But if they don't change the rest of the sequence, it's not going to help. So now they're redesigning the entire sequence, and we'll see how that works. So that's an example of that. And now I've gotten my sort of capstone project of my career, which is a USAID-funded higher ed reform project in Vietnam, which for me is fascinating. One of my older brothers spent a lot of energy staying out of that country. My other older brother had allergies. He didn't have to worry, although that meant I couldn't have pets as a kid. But I have always been fascinated with the country, and so I just jumped on this opportunity. And in this, it's a very comprehensive project, well-funded by USAID. It's $15 million on our side and $100 million on the Vietnam side, which comes from the World Bank, so it's just a loan. And it's trying to do very comprehensive modernization. Has several pillars, governance, and so on. There I am on the upper right. This is what I call my proof of existence picture with my colleagues Mai Feng and Lan Dang. And one of the areas I work in is a new term for me, IQA, internal quality assurance, which I kind of find a bit of an oxymoron, or It's not a comfortable term for me because we don't use that term, but it's useful in some ways. So I'm working with colleagues there to see if we can help them move from a compliance mentality to an improvement orientation. And so I've been doing a lot of presentations and will continue on this idea of internal quality assurance. And in doing that, I had a few visualizations I thought that expressed well where I've come to thinking on this. This is the first one. Now that I have IQA as an idea, I will contrast that with EQA, external quality assurance. And I characterize them here as problematically parallel processes. And I think that describes it well. And that space in between the external streams and the internal streams is what I call that semi-permeable barrier. There is a relationship, but we have to be very careful as what we let filter through so that we don't have our colleagues resist what we're doing and for those usual ways and good reasons why they resist it, but rather turn it into improvement somehow through that permeable barrier, semi-permeable barrier. This was the other, and when I saw that silo article, I said, wait a second, that's not my experience. So I drew out this generic model. This is not like a prescriptive organizational model. This is just saying, if you want to do this work of institutional effectiveness, as we call it in the US, IQA as it's called there, and now we say it's EAIR, institutional effectiveness, institutional assessment, and institutional research. And you'll see that a lot more these days in the US IR profession, the IEIAIR. And these are the range of activities that are needed. That which supports student learning outcomes assessment and academic program review, that which supports program evaluation, more and more rigorous, and management decision support. And we do not silo them. We approach them in an integrated fashion. That's what Trudy taught me, and it is true, and that's how we avoid these silos and try to keep the word more integrated and more productive. And this is the Vietnamese version in case that is your language. So what have I concluded from all this? Well, first, what does ChatGPT have to say? Can accountability and improvement be reconciled? Oh, yes. They're complementary in the context, and here's how they can be balanced. All you need is continuous improvement culture, clear objectives and goals, external assessment, stakeholder engagement, blah, blah, blah. I realize ChatGPT has gone corporate. It is pushing out an image of things that is not at all critical. So that's a lesson learned about using the current state of AI. I also asked, what about this accountability innovation issue? And it said, well, it can add layers of oversight and potentially slow it down, but it's really essential. So we must do that because we need to strike a balance between the two. And while that's true, it doesn't express how to do it. So I leave you with my conclusion slide. A paradox cannot be solved, and I give you a visual paradox for that purpose. And the only way to keep these two is within that semi-permeable bowl. So those of us who work in higher education need to focus on improvement with accountability in mind, and our colleagues on the accountability side need to focus on that with improvement in mind, and then we have to work together. And finally, if you are a scholar, please walk in the shoes of those who do this work, so you can understand what the actual experience is like. And so with that, I will say thank you and leave you with Emily Dickinson's poem on hopefulness, which I give you because I am still hopeful. And why? Because it has nothing to do with what I think. It's inside me, and it will always be. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Well, Victor, thank you very much indeed for using your autoethnographic approach.
Thank you. I almost put that in there. That's what this was.
It's a great meme now, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And it has been informative and delightful. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And it was a marvelous tone and style of lecture for our last day when we're all a bit exhausted, as you can.
Me as well.
You're a bit exhausted too.
Yes.
This does work, yes? Sort of? Anyway, we'll just take a couple of questions because we want to try and keep up with the schedule the best we possibly can. Anybody would like to discuss anything or ask anything? Bruno Brooker, first of all.
very nice and yeah, rich presentation. I have one question. We all spend a lot of time on accountability, performance, measurement, improvements, and so on and so on. And I've always been wondering, what if we would all stop doing this? Would we do worse or not? What do you think?
You want the counterfactual, I take it. Well, I think we need to do some quasi-experimental research on that. It's an interesting thought experiment, and probably best served, I'm trying to think if I can conjure up, where does that not happen? And when it does not happen, I can do better. It was not the case early on in higher education that we were subject to these pressures. They only did come about in the modern era, if you will. So why can't we just go back to those days in the early 20th century or in the 1800s when we were just autonomous and free to pursue the life of the mind? And it's because we are much more important now than ever before, and many other people rely on us. So I think to suggest that thought for me suggests that we basically forget about our stakeholders, just do what we think is right. And I think that's dangerous. Now, you might say, no, we inherently will take our stakeholders, whatever we as individuals perceive those to be, into mind when we do that. But the question is, if we're doing that as a community of independent scholars without some sort of commonality or community or framing around it, I think we will not succeed as institutions in serving the public. We may succeed as scholars pursuing knowledge, but that's just one of our roles now. These are other roles now, and they are more dominant. Research universities are still the most, educate the most students, but their portion of that is going down. In the US, it is down to 25 to 30%. In Europe, it's in, I believe, the 45 to 50% range. Benedetta Lepori and I have a chart on that. I can't think it. So we're just much more, others are much more dependent on us than ever before, so we can't afford that anymore.
Yeah, very good. Now, I think Regina Eichinger would have something. No? Okay, right. Well, then I'll thank Victor very much indeed for his lecture and ask you to express your appreciation in the usual way.
Thank you. Thank you. I try not to be conventional.
Was written.
Thank you.
Very, very much.